let's open it up for questions about something other than science and medicine necessarily. So more of the patient experience and practical issues.
Chocolate. I'm good on chocolate.
Are there lung cancer treatments available using patients' tumor to create a vaccine for them? So that's really not so much for you guys. So I'd say not at this time, except in a clinical trial setting. It's a pretty cumbersome approach, this idea of taking your own tumor tissue. Usually that takes a long time to do, and it's obscenely expensive, and so it's not really something that, and it's also something that hasn't necessarily been successful in large numbers of patients. So with the kind of successes we're seeing with more broadly applicable approaches of doing things to accelerate the immune system for everybody and create therapies that don't need to be individualized, I think that is the more exciting approach than trying to create an individualized treatment vaccine for a patient that has very limited success rates and much higher costs in associating and making a tailored therapy. Okay, I don't know if you have any knowledge of, for lung cancer patients who work, what can we do in a right-to-work state? Any thoughts from either of you about for those patients who work and any barriers to continuing to work?
I've seen some discussions about this online over the years, and it appears to me that, unfortunately, if your provider or your employer decides that they can't use you anymore, you're kind of out of luck in a right-to-work state. There are discussions as to whether or not you want to disclose things to disclose your disease to your employer. But part of the issue is if you're probably going to have to take time off to do treatment, and if you don't tell them, that can cause some problems. I do know some people who've continued to work through treatment. They thankfully didn't have severe side effects. And with our targeted therapies, it can be easier.
Okay.
Well, whether or not you reside in a right-to-work state, there are federal protections in place. So most everyone, is, if they've been working at an employer for a period of 12 months or a certain number of hours, they can take family medical leave. And then there's a way to use that either consecutively or intermittently and extend it out so that you're not, to take optimal advantage of that protection. And then it's just you hope to have a nice rapport with your employer and just come to a resolution if you're having to take more time. And then, the ADA prevents against, unnecessary discrimination. And of course, we work with attorneys who say, if you're looking at prospective employment, new employment, that they would tell you that you don't have to disclose anything about your previous cancer history.
Great.
It doesn't have to be a part of the conversation.
Some other good practical questions here. One about any input about patients seeking access to drugs from outside the country. I presume that more means bringing in from Canada or something like that, or potentially it could be going out of the country for a trial, but particularly I don't know if your work really is intended to obviate that need, or if you sometimes have situations where that might be a more accepted or encouraged approach.
Well, I would say that, there are patients who want access to non-FDA approved, drugs that are in the pipeline, but are considered off-label. Perhaps they've been FDA approved for melanoma, for another type of cancer. We do have a way of appealing, and we do have our resources and sources of evidence or efficacy. So we do a lot of digging, and we do a lot of appeal writing for patients who want to pursue those treatments that are outside the standard of care. Like I mentioned earlier, there are compassionate use programs that many of the pharmaceutical manufacturers offer. if you can show proof of a payer denial, if your insurer repeatedly denies. But if it's something, it's hard for us to directly assist with pursuit of a treatment that's being, trialed or practiced outside of the country. So it's kind of difficult.
Any input? No. Okay. A question about the challenge, the benefits, but also challenges of being an e-patient, and specifically that you can empower yourself, you can get support, you can get knowledge, but you also expose yourself to some sad stories, and I've certainly seen in the GRACE discussion portion of the site that, people get attached to other people, and sometimes the outcomes are not good, and it can lead to a period of grief, honestly, in online communities. So how do you balance that value of attachment and support and education with also the vulnerability of connecting to people who, no matter what, there is a risk of bad things happening?
It's true. If you build connection within the lung cancer community, you're going to have friends die. And that can be hard. I had a stretch where there was like 3 or 4 within a very short period of time, and I think I kind of was in shock. That was probably the most anxiety I ever had before my next scan. It was probably close to a panic attack. And then after that, it kind of died down. I hate to say I've kind of become used to the idea that I'm going to lose friends. It doesn't hit me quite as hard as it used to, but I do find I sometimes have to take a break from going into the online forums and get barraged by headline after headline of help, my mother is dying, help, my sister has cancer, help, my dad is stage 4. It would be nice if some of the forums were a little more organized so you could search and tell them what you want to see instead of having to see all of the headlines come at you all at once. It's also kind of hard to put yourself out there. I really had to think hard about whether I wanted to go public with my lung cancer. And I'm in a fortunate situation where I don't have to work, so I don't have to worry about retributions from my employer. And my family already knew about it. But even so, I have to be careful sometimes online of certain news, not announcing it to online until I've had a chance to tell certain family members that it might be a shock for them.
So very legitimate concerns. So a couple of very related questions, and that is just on, one is how many lung cancer forums do you look at? But I think we can address that along with just in terms of trying to judge the range of how do you assess the value and credibility of the various websites that are available. I don't know if you do much outreach or it's primarily for patients finding you, but I certainly think one of the most important factors in this whole field of education is know your source. Everyone has their biases. Doctors do, and patients do, and pharma companies do, and just understand that everyone comes in with their own biases, and so I think it's an own knowledge base. And so, how do you value some over another? What are you looking for? And, what makes you want to avoid some, I suppose?
I had some slides that are in my set that I did not have a chance to go over that talked about some of the resources that I use. I find government sites like cancer.gov is useful. The lung cancer advocacy groups, GRACE, Longevity, LCA, et cetera, have lots of good facts and good information. For instance, on the Longevity site, there's some really great questions to ask your doctor that have been compiled. So I find those things are very useful. There's many cancer centers have sites, MSK, I'm sorry, that's Sloan Kettering.
Right.
Lots of places like that. So I go to those places where I trust the source that you're talking about. I also will search on PubMed or Google to look for particular journal articles, but From the abstracts, it can be very difficult to judge the quality of the science or the reputation of the source. Just because there's a journal article doesn't necessarily mean it's good science. So while that's better than just going to a random website where you know nothing about the person, you still need to take it somewhat with a grain of salt. It's very easy to find two different journal articles that disagree with each other. Nobody has the answer for lung cancer.
I think it's also important for the patient world to understand that there is a spectrum from preclinical lab-based work to a randomized phase 3 trial, and we all have somewhat different expectations about what's needed, but it's kind of like when the journey from a bill becoming a law. I mean, seeing something work in a test tube in cancer cells, everything fights cancer. And you could pour ketchup on cancer cells, they'll die in a test tube, but that doesn't mean that helps fight cancer. And there's an enormous drop-off in things working in a test tube to things working in a mouse, and an even greater gulf from mice to people.
And also from having a study that's 2 or 3 people to seeing if it works in 300 people.
Exactly. I mean, we have seen a humbling, frustrating collection of agents that looked very good in what's called phase 2 trials with a few dozen patients, and then test them in a large number of centers with hundreds of patients, randomizing to standard versus new drug, and finding new drug didn't work nearly as well as it seemed to in a few dozen patients in 1 or 2 centers. So there's a big drop-off there, and I would just say sometimes you'll have people asking online or coming in with something that's they see on the news about everything is reported as a breakthrough or the most horrifying poison, and it's a lot of times it's just drama.
Yeah, needing to take things with a grain of salt. And I think it's also important for patients to kind of distill down what you say. There's a difference between a study of one person, like an anecdote, and a study where you have a whole group of people. I mean, yes, if you've got 300 people and only 2% respond, it's possible you're going to be in the 2%. But if there's a study of 300 people where 50% of the people respond, I'd rather go with the 50% option. So when you're considering possible treatment options, don't go with something just because there's some people who respond. Try and find out if it's likely you are going to respond.
Well, that's just to pick that up again. It's very easy to find anecdotal cases of miraculous outcomes. I mean, and lots of things are marketed online and on television and in cancer and outside of cancer of that either somebody in a commercial, or it could be, my sister's friend's cousin tried this miracle treatment and they were told that they had X months to live and they're still alive 5 years later. The challenge is even a broken clock is right twice a day. That we have no idea what the denominator is. Are there 500 other people who did that who didn't have that result? But you don't get that highlighted, and that's what the clinical trials help put into context. Is a very good outcome on immunotherapy a one-time event, or is it something that happens in a significant fraction of people? I know we've been talking for a while. I don't know if you have any thoughts about particularly reputable or less reputable approaches.
Well, for me, depending on whether your predicament be one of access or one of finances, it helps to speak with a person, an oncology social worker or a case manager such as myself, and we're trained to know what websites, what services, what organizations are solid and dependable, depending on your singular issue. So, like I explained, needy meds. If you have a drug issue, whether it be access or an affordability issue, that's a wonderful resource. But yeah, definitely avail yourself of a knowledgeable person, a social worker, who can kind of assess your issue and get to a solution as promptly as possible.
So with that, we're coming to the close of the hour and the close of the session. I would like to take a moment to thank the sponsors again, our gold sponsors, AstraZeneca, Boehringer Ingelheim, Genentech, and Novartis. Silver sponsors Clovis and Foundation Medicine. Video sponsors Threshold, is Threshold, and advocacy partner of Smart Patients. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jack.
Of course.